Okay, so now that we have talked about consumer surplus and producer surplus, we are ready to talk about the efficiency of markets. The question that we want to answer is whether the allocation of resources in decentralized market economies is desirable or not. Think about it. The outcome from competitive markets comes from the interaction of millions of individuals acting on their own self-interest. You and I, consumers, we are trying to make the best we can out of our limited income, yes? We want to make the best out of our hard-earned money. Firms also want to do the same thing. They want to maximize their profits for the efforts into turning inputs into goods and services and for the risk that it takes to run a business. So the question is, after buyers and sellers they interact in markets, whether the outcome is desirable or not. And thinking about this is going to be very important because, at least for two reasons. Number one, because it's going to have implications for the role of the government. So if the answer is yes, that perfectly competitive markets, they do a good job in allocating resources, then we would say that there should be a limited intervention of the government in markets. However, if the answer is no, it's not desirable, then we should analyze to see if government intervention can improve market outcomes. Second reason why this analysis is important is because the tools that we're going to be using here will be able to, it's going to allow us to analyze alternative government policies. In the next couple of chapters, we're going to do two applications. Number one, we're going to look at what are the consequences of a tax on goods and services. We want to know who are the winners and losers from that, and we want to analyze what are the distributive consequences of a tax on goods and services. We also going to look at what are the consequences of free trade and restrictions to free trade. So does trade improve the economic well-being of market participants? And when we have restrictions to trade, whether that is going to reduce or not the economic well-being. And then if there are winners and there are losers, we want to answer the interesting question about whether the gains to the winners outweighs the losses to the losers. So doing the analysis that we're going to be using here, the tools here are going to allow us to think about other government policies. How will we answer the question of whether the allocation of resources in competitive markets is desirable or not? Well, we have one measure of society's well-being. We call it total surplus, and it's the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Remember that consumer surplus are the gains to consumers from buying a good at a price lower than what they're willing to pay for the good. And the producer surplus is a gain to producers of earning a price that is higher than the costs of production. So if you remember from that discussion, when we are calculating the total surplus, different quantities have a different value, have different willingness to pay for the good, and different quantities also have different costs of production because there are differences in technologies that firms use, and there are different opportunity costs for the different sellers. So it is, when we're thinking about total surplus, what we're thinking about is the accumulation of consumer surplus and producer surplus for the different units. So we're thinking about the sum of those individual consumer surplus and producer surplus. So if we think about the definition of consumer surplus, so it's the sum of the willingness to pay minus the price plus the sum of the price minus the marginal cost for all those units that firms are producing. So a little of mathematical manipulation would show us that at the end of the day, the total surplus becomes the value to buyers minus the cost to sellers. So another way of thinking about this is that total surplus is going to be the net value to society from producing and consuming a good. This is kind of neat because when we are thinking about how society allocates resources, how much land, how much labor do we use for producing good X versus good Y, and so on? Well, at least now we have a measurement that we can use. As long as the allocation of resources increases the total surplus, that is a good allocation of resources, right? Because the larger is the value to buyers compared to the cost of the resources needed to produce that good, then we would say that it's desirable to produce that good. And that's going to be our measurement of economic well-being. To determine whether it is a desirable outcome or not, we're going to answer 3 questions. We're going to ask whether the outcome is efficient or not, and what we mean by this is whether the equilibrium quantities maximize total surplus. Then we're going to reflect on which consumers are the ones who are buying the good and which producers are the ones who are producing the good. And these are going to be very interesting answers that we will learn. Before getting into the details of the analysis, there's a couple of things that I want to remind students. Number one, we can think about the demand curve as a marginal value curve. If you remember from our analysis, at any level of output Q, the height of the demand curve was the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer. So in our previous example, we looked at 4 consumers, and those consumers have different willingness to pay for a good because we all have different preferences. Some of us value a good more highly than others. And so when the market price is $300, then that would make Flea to purchase the first unit of the good, okay? Because he's the one that has the highest willingness to pay. So this willingness to pay, we consider it to be the value of that first unit. So we call it the marginal value. So that is the value of the first unit. When the price drops, for example, to 250, now with the price of 250, Flea still continues to buy the good, but now Anthony wants to buy the second unit, right? So this is the willingness to pay of Anthony when the price is 250 that makes him buy a marginal unit, an additional unit, and therefore we consider that amount of the second unit, the willingness to pay from Anthony, that is the additional value to society. We call that the marginal value to society. Similarly for Chad and John, so we can call the demand curve a marginal value curve. This is true for the staircase demand curve and also for the smooth linear demand curve that we used to analyzing and that we will continue analyzing for the rest of the semester. So remember, the demand curve, it's a marginal value curve. So for example, at the level of output Q equal to 5, the height of the demand curve shows a value of $50. So we would say that this is the willingness to pay of the 5th unit. Individuals that had a higher willingness to pay than $50, they already bought the pair of shoes, yes, okay. But for this 5th unit of the pair of shoes, the willingness to pay is $50. So this is the value, this is the additional value of that 5th unit. And we say that the marginal value is $50. Level of output, for example, for the 10th unit, the marginal buyer is willing to pay $40. So when the price was higher than $40, there was someone who would not be willing to pay for that 10th pair of shoes, but when the price drops to $40, there is someone in the market who would be willing to pay for it because the value of that person, it's equal to the price that they are paying. So we would say that for the 10th unit, the marginal value of that 10th unit is $40. The second thing that we must remember is that the supply curve could be thought of as a marginal cost curve. Remember that earlier we said that at each level of output Q, the height of the supply curve is the cost of the marginal seller. So remember that the marginal cost curve shows us the willingness to sell for sellers, and that willingness to sell depends on the costs to the seller. In our example, we had 3 sellers. They had different costs. Those could be different costs because of different technologies or because of different opportunity costs. At that point, we said that Jack has the lowest opportunity cost, yes? And when the price is $10, that would make Jack to produce the first unit in the market, okay? She would be willing to supply that first unit at the price of 10 or higher. So we say that the cost of the first unit, the extra cost of that additional unit, it's $10. So when the price is $20, then with a cost of $20 for Janet, then in this case, she would be willing to supply that second unit. So we would say that the extra cost of that marginal unit, that additional unit, that second unit, it's $20. So that's the marginal cost of the second unit. And similarly, the height of the supply curve for the third unit shows us the marginal cost of that third unit. That is the additional cost that makes a seller supply that third unit. So we can call the marginal cost curve, we could call the supply curve also a marginal cost curve, and that's going to help us for the interpretation in our analysis. So this is true for the staircase supply curve, and it's also true for the nice, smooth, linear supply curve. So the idea that I want to remind you is that the supply curve, it's a marginal cost curve. So for example, suppose that the market quantity is Q equal to 15, then what the supply curve, the height of the supply curve indicates is that the cost of the 15th unit is $30. We say that that is the marginal cost, that is the cost of the additional unit, in this case is the 15th unit. If we now consider a level of output of Q equal to 25, then the height of the supply curve is going to show us that the marginal cost of that 25th unit is $40. So producing that 25th unit, it costs $40. That's the marginal cost of the 25th unit. Remember that different units have different costs. Okay, with this in mind, now we have all that we need in order to evaluate whether the market equilibrium is efficient in the sense that it maximizes total surplus. So let's consider a market with an equilibrium price of $30 and equilibrium quantities of 15 units. So we know that the total surplus is the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the market price line, and is given by this blue triangle. Producer surplus is the area between the market price line and the supply curve. So when we add those two together, the total surplus in this market, which includes the gain to consumers and the gain to producers, is the area within this red triangle. So what we want to ask is whether this market equilibrium is efficient. Again, efficient in the sense of whether it is maximizing total surplus. So what happens if we produce less output, or what happens if we produce more output? Is the total surplus going to be higher or lower when we deviate from this equilibrium? Is what we want to show next. Let's first think about what is the consequence of producing a level of output that is lower than the equilibrium. For example, let's suppose that output is equal to 10. So with a level of output equal to 10, we could calculate what is the total surplus in this market. And as you can imagine, it is the area between the demand curve and the supply curve from 0 all the way to 10 units. And at this point, we can easily see that that total surplus, the blue area within this trapezoid, it's smaller than the area that we looked at before, the area of this triangle. So that's sufficient to see that producing a level of output lower than the equilibrium amount does not maximize total surplus. However, I want you all to learn to make decisions at the margin whenever possible. So making decisions about the margin is thinking about one extra unit. So I want you to think about the additional cost and the additional value of producing each of those units. So for example, for the 10th unit, the cost of producing that additional unit, that 10th unit, is $25. That's given by the height of the supply curve. And when we want to know the additional value, or the marginal value as we call it, the additional value of that 10th unit, it's $40. So we can see here that the marginal value is greater than the marginal cost for that 10th unit. So when you think about the accumulation of surplus from producing more units, the 10th unit, it's increasing total surplus. Why? Because the marginal value, that is the additional value of producing the 10th unit, exceeds the additional cost of producing that 10th unit. So that is good for society, and it increases total surplus. And by the way, that is true for all the points to the left of the equilibrium quantities of 15. You can see for each of those quantities, the marginal value is greater than the marginal cost. Another way of seeing that is by observing that the demand curve, or marginal value curve, it's higher than the marginal cost curve. So we think about the market producing different quantities starting from 0. As we increase those quantities, total surplus, it's increasing because for all of those quantities, the marginal value exceeds the marginal cost. Now let's think about producing a level of output that is higher than the equilibrium level. For example, suppose that we are producing a level of output of Q equal to 20. With Q equal to 20, you can imagine that as we produce from 0 to 15, well, total surplus is given by this blue triangle, and that is a positive amount as before because the marginal value is greater than the marginal cost. But what about the additional 5 units that goes from 15 to 20? There's definitely an area between the demand and the supply curve. But the question is the area of this red triangle, does it add up to the total surplus or does it subtract from the total surplus? To answer that question, we must realize what is the additional value and the additional cost of all of those units to the right of the equilibrium level of 15. So for example, if you think about the 20th unit, the additional cost of producing the 20th unit is given by the height of the supply curve, and the additional cost is $35. And when we think about the additional value, that is given by the height of the demand curve or the marginal value curve. So the 20th unit, we can see that the additional cost is larger than the additional value. And therefore, producing that 20th unit does not increase total surplus, it actually decreases total surplus, you see? Another way of seeing it is that the additional value does not outweigh the additional cost, so we should not be using resources to produce this good, to produce these units. And that is true for all units to the right of the equilibrium level of 15. So for all those units, we can see that the marginal cost is greater than the marginal value. Another way of seeing this is that to the left of the equilibrium, to the right of the equilibrium, I should say, I must be careful, to the right of the equilibrium, the marginal cost curve is higher than the marginal value curve. The supply curve is higher than the demand curve. So for all those quantities to the right of 15, producing those quantities actually reduces total surplus. This is a negative in the calculation of total surplus. So if we were producing 20 units, we are better off reducing the quantity of output until we get to the level of 15. The lesson from this graph is that producing more than the equilibrium is inefficient because it doesn't maximize total surplus. All right, so that takes us back again to the initial analysis where at the equilibrium quantity of 15 units, we get the highest possible total surplus given by this triangle right here. So the lesson is producing more or less than the equilibrium, it's inefficient. Why? Because producing more or less than the equilibrium does not maximize total surplus. Now let's think about our second question. Which buyers consume the good? At an equilibrium price of $30, the individuals that will buy the good are those that have a willingness to pay higher than $30. Those are the individuals along this upper segment of the demand curve. Their willingness to sell is higher than the ongoing equilibrium market price, so they buy the good. Individuals with a willingness to pay that is lower than the ongoing equilibrium market price, they will not buy the good. Those are the individuals in this lower segment of the demand curve. So what we see is that the individuals that end up purchasing the good are the individuals that have the highest willingness to pay. So those are the individuals who value the good the most highly are the ones who are actually consuming it. So when we think about the allocation of resources, now what we are observing here is that who gets to consume the good? The individuals that have the highest value for the good. That is kind of interesting. For our third question, which sellers produce the good? At an ongoing market price of $30, only sellers with costs below $30 are the ones who would be willing to supply and sell the good. So we see that all those firms along this segment of the supply curve, those are the ones who have marginal costs below the equilibrium market price are the ones who sell the good. Individuals along this segment of the marginal cost curve or supply curve, those individuals, those firms have a marginal cost that is higher than the ongoing equilibrium market price. So they would not be willing to sell at with those prices and those costs. So therefore we see that The sellers with the lower cost are the ones who actually produce the good. Those who cannot produce it at the lowest cost do not produce it. And this is also kind of neat, because what we observe is that the markets of forces of supply and demand that gets us to this equilibrium. And at the end of the day, the firms and sellers who are going to use the resources to produce the good are those who can produce it at a lower cost. And that is kind of neat. So what are the answers to our three questions? Does the equilibrium quantity maximize total surplus? The answer, we saw that it was yes. Producing any amount higher or lower than the equilibrium quantity would not increase the total surplus. The quantity that maximizes the total surplus is the equilibrium quantity. Which consumers buy the good? The goods are going to be consumed by the buyers who value them most highly, those that have a willingness to pay that is higher than the market price. And which producers produce good? The goods are going to be produced by the producers with the lowest costs, which is kind of neat because we know that the resources are going to be used by those firms that are more efficient in the sense of being able to use it to produce it at the lowest cost. So I think the lessons that we learned from this analysis are very enlightening. Think about it. We started very simple, a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve that are very intuitive. From that, we talked about how we get to an equilibrium, and now we are analyzing whether that equilibrium is desirable or not. We have properly defined what desirable is. It is that it's producing a way that it maximizes the gains from buyers and sellers who buy and sell in this market. And we also have talked about who are the individuals who actually get the good, the ones that value it the most, and which firms are the ones who produce the good, the ones that can produce it at the lowest cost. All those things sound very good. One of the first individuals to start thinking about the interactions of market was Adam Smith. He was a philosopher who, back in the 18th century, he wrote about in a book titled The Wealth of Nations. And amongst the many passages that are told, that are all the different passages coming from his book, one of them that catches my attention is this one right here. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. So they don't do it for love out of others, they do it in their own self-interest, and that way we get the meat from the butcher, the beer from the brewer, and the bread from the baker. Furthermore, every individual neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So this is a very enlightening idea. So the fact that self-interested individuals acting for their own good, the outcome of that self-interest produces an outcome that is better than if we coordinate it. It's a very, very powerful thinking. And it's something that several centuries after, with a more rigorous way of thinking by using the math and the graphs that we now use, we are able to illustrate the points more clearly and more rigorously. Two centuries ago, Adam Smith was able to put it very eloquently. But how does the invisible hand that Adam Smith described, how does it work? Well, pretty much the interaction of millions of individuals, self-interested individuals interacting in markets, it takes into account all the information about buyers and sellers, their willingness to sell, their willingness to pay, and the market prices. So it guides everyone in the market to the best possible outcome, that is the efficient outcome that maximizes total surplus. And so this illustrates how free markets are a good way to organize economic activity. It doesn't require the coordination of a centralized planning agency in the government to come up with an outcome. Here we are able to see that the outcome that happens is the most efficient one. And when you have conservatives and libertarians thinking about embracing the prowess of free markets, pretty much the mechanisms that we have been describing here, it's what they have in mind, these powerful results that we are analyzing here. However, it is important to point out that all this analysis of the forces of supply and demand allocating resources efficiently, it hinges on two very important assumptions about how markets work. Number one, we have been assuming that markets are perfectly competitive. What does this mean? This means that there are many buyers and many sellers in such a way that no individual have any power over the market price. So in many instances, that is not true. It also implies that what we're looking at, it's a homogeneous good. So in other words, an apple is an apple, an orange is an orange. And that might be true for apples and oranges, or not far from true, but for many other goods, it's not true. Product differentiation is important for many other products. It is not true that a car is a car. There are a lot of differences between cars, and it's not true that a smartphone is a smartphone. Different smartphones have different characteristics, and so they are not the same. So many markets are not perfectly competitive in these two senses. Second, the outcome in the market matters only to the buyers and sellers in that market. It often happens that some bystanders are affected by the outcomes in markets. So when these two assumptions do not hold, the market equilibrium is probably not going to be efficient, but we can use the tools of economic analysis in order to see what type of government interventions can be done in order to improve those market outcomes. In particular, we're going to talk about two market failures. Number one, we're going to analyze a situation when there's some market power. So when there is a single buyer or seller, or a small group of buyers or sellers that can have some control over the market price, we will have, in this situation, markets are going to be inefficient. One extreme example of this would be when you have a single seller producing a good or service. So take, for example, suppose that there's only one gas station in Houston. And if you want to buy gas, then you must buy it from this one gas station. What do you think is going to happen? You can imagine that this one gas station is going to have excessive power over market prices. So it's going to take advantage of that, and that's going to have a reduction in a total surplus. Of course, the monopoly, as we call it, will not be able to charge any price that it wants because the law of demand still applies. So increasing prices would reduce quantities. So it would have to take into consideration the law of demand to make decisions. Externalities is the second market failure that we're going to be looking at. And externalities happens when the decisions of buyers and sellers affect the people who are not participants in the market at all. Go-to example of this would be, for example, pollution. When you have a factory that is making decisions on how much output to produce, it would not take into consideration the consequences, the harm that it would have on the environment. So the equilibrium quantity level of output that will be produced when you have an externality like pollution is not going to be efficient from the standpoint of society. And we will talk about what government interventions, what they can do to improve the market outcome. Last but not least, we must make some remarks about the distinction between market efficiency versus equality. It is important to note that efficiency does not imply equality or fairness. It is better to think about efficiency as the size of the economic pie. So when we say that a market outcome is efficient, what we're saying is that the economic pie is larger in the sense of total surplus being larger. The gains from consumers and producers from participating in the market, it's larger. When we think about equality, we must think about the way the slices of the pie are distributed. Unfortunately, economics will not be able to say how the pie should be distributed. However, economic analysis can inform us about the distributive implications of alternative policies. So we will be able to make analysis that tells us about the efficiency of market outcomes and also recognize the distributive consequences of it. At the end of the day, however, it's going to be up to society to determine the priorities and make the necessary value judgments. And finally, efficiency and equality are frequently opposed. For example, we've talked about price controls. For instance, when we think about minimum wages, we've talked that it's meant to improve the quality of life of low income individuals, but at the same time, we saw how that can produce some involuntary unemployment. Similarly, when we're thinking about rent controls, that is also meant to improve the quality of life of individuals, but at the same time, it can also produce shortages in the market for apartment rentals. So efficiency and equality are frequently opposed. Another example would be income redistribution policies that may reduce the incentives to hard work. So for instance, think about policies that are meant to provide more cash transfers to individuals. So pretty much if you're getting a check for nothing, that is going to reduce the incentives to work. I'm not saying that those policies are incorrect. I'm just saying that we must realize that there are some incentives that are lost for hard work, and we have to come up with policy designs that reduce those reductions in the incentives. Now, let's use what we have learned to think about how desirable would be a market for kidneys. So if we have a market for kidneys, if we allow individuals to sell their organs in exchange for payment, would that improve the quality of life of individuals? Would that improve the economic well-being of individuals or the life in general of individuals? So a group of economists was asked about this, and 57% of them agreed. And there was a large number also that was uncertain. But there's no right answer to this. Whatever you think is the right answer, there are, of course, ethical considerations. But in terms of the efficiency of it, right? Providing a market, that's probably going to make available kidneys to individuals that are willing to pay for it, right? So what would you think it would happen if we had a market for kidneys? Would there be more kidneys available for individuals that need kidney transplants or less? Well, definitely probably more. Now that there is an incentive for individuals to sell kidneys, then it would be possible for individuals that are willing to pay for it to get it. But as we mentioned before, typically efficiency considerations and distributive considerations are opposed. One concern would be, a very valid concern would be that it might be possible that the individuals that would be willing to sell their kidneys are individuals that are low income. And so that is one consideration that is definitely valid. So you can see in this an application of the concepts that we talked about without supply and demand. We can see that there is some pros and cons from allowing markets to take care of something of value, in this case the kidney transplants. And there is some redistributive considerations, and there's also some efficiency considerations. Here I leave you with a summary of the key concepts that we have talked about. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and more importantly, the key takeaway from this analysis is that perfectly competitive markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Policymakers should be concerned about the efficiency, the quality of economic outcomes of different policies. And we can use the supply and the demand in order to analyze the outcomes of the market. Now, of course, markets, when there are presences of market failures, markets will not allocate the resources efficiently. And those are the topics that we're going to take on in the next couple of chapters.